This Side of Paradise, the classic novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Book 1, The Romantic Egotist. Chapter 1, Amory, son of Beatrice. Amory Blaine inherited from his mother every trait, except the stray, inexpressible few that made him worthwhile. His father, an ineffectual, inarticulate man with a taste for Byron and a habit of drowsing over the Encyclopedia Britannica, grew wealthy at 30 through the death of 2 elder brothers, successful Chicago brokers, and in the first flush of feeling that the world was his, went to Bar Harbor and met Beatrice O'Hara. In consequence, Stephen Blaine handed down to posterity his height of just under 6 feet and his tendency to waver at crucial moments, these 2 abstractions appearing in his son Amory. For many years he hovered in the background of his family's life, an unassertive figure with a face half obliterated by lifeless, silky hair, continually occupied in taking care of his wife, continually harassed by the idea that he didn't and couldn't understand her. But Beatrice Blaine, there was a woman. Early pictures taken on her father's estate at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, or in Rome at the Sacred Heart Convent, an educational extravagance that in her youth was only for the daughters of the exceptionally wealthy, showed the exquisite delicacy of her features, the consummate art and simplicity of her clothes. A brilliant education she had, her youth passed in Renaissance glory. She was versed in the latest gossip of the older Roman families, known by name as a fabulously wealthy American girl to Cardinal Vittori and Queen Margherita, and more subtle celebrities that one must have had some culture even to have heard of. She learned in England to prefer whiskey and soda to wine, and her small talk was broadened in 2 senses during a winter in Vienna. All in all, Beatrice O'Hara absorbed the sort of education that will be quite impossible ever again. A tutelage measured by the number of things and people one could be contemptuous of and charming about. A culture rich in all arts and traditions, barren of all ideas, in the last of those days when the great gardener clipped the inferior roses to produce one perfect bud. In her less important moments, she returned to America, met Stephen Blaine, and married him. This almost entirely because she was a little bit weary, a little bit sad. Her only child was carried through a tiresome season and brought into the world on a spring day in '96. When Amory was 5, he was already a delightful companion for her. He was an auburn-haired boy, with great, handsome eyes which he would grow up to in time, a facile, imaginative mind, and a taste for fancy dress. From his 4th to his 10th year, he did the country with his mother in her father's private car, from Coronado, where his mother became so bored that she had a nervous breakdown in a fashionable hotel, down to Mexico City, where she took a mild, almost epidemic consumption. This trouble pleased her, and later she made use of it as an intrinsic part of her atmosphere, especially after several astounding bracers. So, while more or less fortunate little rich boys were defying governesses on the beach at Newport, or being spanked or tutored or read to from Do and Dare, or Frank on the Mississippi, Amory was biting acquiescent bellboys in the Waldorf, outgrowing a natural repugnance to chamber music and symphonies, and deriving a highly specialized education from his mother. Amory. Yes, Beatrice. Such a quaint name for his mother. She encouraged it. Dear, don't think of getting out of bed yet. I've always suspected that early rising in early life makes one nervous. Clotilde is having your breakfast brought up. All right. I am feeling very old today, Amory, she would sigh, her face a rare cameo of pathos, her voice exquisitely modulated, her hands as facile as Bernhardt's. My nerves are on edge, on edge. We must leave this terrifying place tomorrow and go searching for sunshine. Amory's penetrating green eyes would look out through tangled hair at his mother. Even at this age, he had no illusions about her. Amory. Oh, yes. I want you to take a red-hot bath as hot as you can bear it, and just relax your nerves. You can read in the tub if you wish. She fed him sections of the Fêtes Galantes before he was 10. At 11, he could talk glibly, if rather reminiscently, of Brahms and Mozart and Beethoven. One afternoon, When left alone in the hotel at Hot Springs, he sampled his mother's apricot cordial, and as the taste pleased him, he became quite tipsy. This was fun for a while, but he essayed a cigarette in his exaltation and succumbed to a vulgar, plebeian reaction. Though this incident horrified Beatrice, it also secretly amused her and became part of what in a later generation would have been termed her line. "This son of mine," he heard her tell a room full of awestruck, admiring women one day, "is entirely sophisticated and quite charming, but delicate. We're all delicate. Here, you know." Her hand was radiantly outlined against her beautiful bosom. Then, sinking her voice to a whisper, she told them of the apricot cordial. They rejoiced, for she was a brave raconteuse. But many were the keys turned in sideboard locks that night against the possible defection of little Bobby or Barbara. These domestic pilgrimages were invariably in state. 2 maids, the private car, or Mr. Blaine when available, and very often a physician. When Amory had the whooping cough, 4 disgusted specialists glared at each other hunched around his bed. When he took scarlet fever, the number of attendants, including physicians and nurses, totaled 14. However, blood being thicker than broth, he was pulled through. The Blaines were attached to no city. They were the Blaines of Lake Geneva. They had quite enough relatives to serve in place of friends and an enviable standing from Pasadena to Cape Cod. But Beatrice grew more and more prone to like only new acquaintances, as there were certain stories, such as the history of her Constitution and its many amendments, memories of her years abroad, that it was necessary for her to repeat at regular intervals. Like Freudian dreams, they must be thrown off, else they would sweep in and lay siege to her nerves. But Beatrice was critical about American women, especially the floating population of ex-Westerners. "They have accents, my dear," she told Amory. "Not Southern accents or Boston accents. Not an accent attached to any locality, just an accent." She became dreamy. "They pick up old, moth-eaten London accents that are down on their luck and have to be used by someone. They talk as an English butler might after several years in a Chicago Grand Opera Company." She became almost incoherent. Suppose time in every Western woman's life. She feels her husband is prosperous enough for her to have accent. "They try to impress me, my dear." Though she thought of her body as a mass of frailties, she considered her soul quite as ill and therefore important in her life. She had once been a Catholic, but discovering that priests were infinitely more attentive when she was in process of losing or regaining faith in Mother Church, she maintained an enchantingly wavering attitude. Often she deplored the bourgeois quality of the American Catholic clergy, and was quite sure that had she lived in the shadow of the great continental cathedrals, her soul would still be a thin flame on the mighty altar of Rome. Still, next to doctors, priests were her favorite sport. "Ah, Bishop Whiston," she would declare, "I do not want to talk of myself. I can imagine the stream of hysterical women fluttering at your doors, beseeching you to be simpatico." Then, after an interlude filled by the clergyman, "But my mood is oddly dissimilar." Only to bishops and above did she divulge her clerical romance. When she had first returned to her country, there had been a pagan, Swinburnian young man in Asheville, for whose passionate kisses and unsentimental conversations she had taken a decided penchant. They had discussed the matter pro and con with an intellectual romancing quite devoid of sappiness. Eventually, she had decided to marry for background, and the young pagan from Asheville had gone through a spiritual crisis, joined the Catholic Church, and was now Monsignor Darcy. Indeed, Mrs. Blaine, he is still delightful company, quite the Cardinal's right-hand man. Amory will go to him one day, I know, breathed the beautiful lady, and Monsignor Darcy will understand him as he understood me. Amory became 13, rather tall and slender, and more than ever onto his Celtic mother. He had tutored occasionally, the idea being that he was to keep up, at each place, taking up the work where he left off. Yet as no tutor ever found the place he left off, his mind was still in very good shape. What a few more years of this life would have made of him is problematical. However, 4 hours out from land, Italy bound, with Beatrice, his appendix burst, probably from too many meals in bed, and after a series of frantic telegrams to Europe and America, to the amazement of the passengers, the great ship slowly wheeled around and returned to New York to deposit Amory at the pier. You will admit that if it was not life, it was magnificent. After the operation, Beatrice had a nervous breakdown that bore a suspicious resemblance to delirium tremens, and Amory was left in Minneapolis, destined to spend the ensuing 2 years with his aunt and uncle. There, the crude, vulgar air of Western civilization first catches him. In his underwear, so to speak. A kiss for Amory. His lip curled when he read it. "I am going to have a bobbing party," it said. "On Thursday, December the 17th, at 5 o'clock, and I would like it. Very much if you could come. Yours truly, RSVP Myra St. Clair." He had been 2 months in Minneapolis, and his chief struggle had been the concealing from the other guys at school how particularly superior he felt himself to be. Yet this conviction was built upon shifting sands. He had shown off one day in French class, he was in senior French class, to the utter confusion of Mr. Reardon, whose accent Amory damned contemptuously, and to the delight of the class. Mr. Reardon, who had spent several weeks in Paris 10 years before, took his revenge on the verbs whenever he had his book open. But another time, Amory showed off in history class with quite disastrous results. For the boys there were his own age, and they shrilled innuendos at each other all the following week. "Oh, I believe, don't you know, the American Revolution was largely an affair of the mid-duel clauses." Or, "Washington came of very good blood." "Oh, quite good, I believe." Amory ingeniously tried to retrieve himself by blundering on purpose. 2 years before, he had commenced a history of the United States, which, though it only got as far as the colonial wars, had been pronounced by his mother completely enchanting. His chief disadvantage lay in athletics, but as soon as he discovered that it was the touchstone of power and popularity at school, he began to make furious, persistent efforts to excel in the winter sports, and with his ankles aching and bending in spite of his efforts, he skated valiantly around the Lorelei rink every afternoon, wondering how soon he would be able to carry a hockey stick without getting it inexplicably tangled in his skates. The invitation to Miss Myra St. Clair's bobbing party spent the morning in his coat pocket, where it had an intense physical affair with a dusty piece of peanut brittle. During the afternoon, he brought it to light with a sigh, and after some consideration and a preliminary draft in the back of Collar and Daniel's first-year Latin, composed an answer. "My dear Miss St. Clair, your truly charming invitation for the evening of next Thursday. Evening was truly delightful to receive this morning. I will be. Charm and enchanted indeed to present my compliments on next. Thursday evening. Faithfully, Amory Blaine." On Thursday, therefore, he walked pensively along the slippery, shovel-scraped sidewalks and came in sight of Myra's house on the half-hour after 5, a lateness which he fancied his mother would have favored. He waited on the doorstep with his eyes nonchalantly half-closed and planned his entrance with precision. He would cross the floor, not too hastily, to Mrs. St. Clair and say with exactly the correct modulation, "My dear Mrs. St. Clair, I'm frightfully sorry to be late, but my maid—" He paused there and realized he would be quoting, "But my uncle and I had to see a fella. Yes, I've met your enchanting daughter at dancing school." Then he would shake hands, using that slight, half-foreign bow with all the starchy little females, and nod to the fellas who would be standing round, paralyzed into rigid groups for mutual protection. A butler, one of the 3 in Minneapolis, swung open the door. Amory stepped inside and divested himself of cap and coat. He was mildly surprised not to hear the shrill squawk of conversation from the next room, and he decided it must be quite formal. He approved of that, as he approved of the butler. "Miss Myra?" he said. To his surprise, the butler grinned horribly. "Oh yeah," he declared, "she's here." He was unaware that his failure to be Cockney was ruining his standing. Amory considered him coldly. "But," continued the butler, his voice rising unnecessarily. She's the only one what is here. The party's gone. Amory gasped in sudden horror. What? She's been waiting for Amory Blaine. That's you, ain't it? Her mother says that if you showed up by 5:30, you two was to go after him in the Packard. Amory's despair was crystallized by the appearance of Myra herself, bundled to the ears in a polo coat, her face plainly sulky, her voice pleasant only with difficulty. "Lo, Amory." "Lo, Myra." He had described the state of his vitality. "Well, you got here, anyways." "Well, I'll tell you. I guess you don't know about the auto accident," he romanced. Myra's eyes opened wide. "Who was it to?" "Well," he continued desperately, "Uncle and Aunt and I." "Was anyone killed?" Amory paused and then nodded. "Your uncle?" Alarm. "Oh, no, just a horse. A sorta gray horse." At this point, the Immerse butler snickered. "Probably killed the engine," he suggested. Amory would have put him on the rack without a scruple. "We'll go now," said Myra coolly. "You see, Amory, the bobs were ordered for 5 and everybody was here, so we couldn't wait." "Well, I couldn't help it, could I? So Mama said for me to wait till 5:30. We'll catch the bobs before it gets to the Minnehaha Club, Amory." Amory's shredded poise dropped from him. He pictured the happy party jingling along snowy streets, the appearance of the limousine, the horrible public descent of him and Myra before 60 reproachful eyes. His apology. A real one this time. He sighed aloud. "What?" inquired Myra. "Nothing. I was just yawning." "Are we going to surely catch up with them before they get there?" He was encouraging a faint hope that they might slip into the Minnehaha Club and meet the others there, be found in blasé seclusion before the fire and quite regain his lost attitude. "Oh, sure, Mike. We'll catch 'em all right. Let's hurry." He became conscious of his stomach. As they stepped into the machine, he hurriedly slapped the paint of diplomacy over a rather box-like plan he had conceived. It was based upon some trade lasts gleaned at dancing school, to the effect that he was awful good-looking and English, sort of. "Myra," he said, lowering his voice and choosing his words carefully, "I beg 1,000 pardons. Can you ever forgive me?" She regarded him gravely, his intent green eyes, his mouth, that to her 13-year-old arrow-collar taste was the quintessence of romance. Yes, Myra could forgive him very easily. "Why, yes, sure." He looked at her again, and then dropped his eyes. He had lashes. "I'm awful," he said sadly. "I'm different. I don't know why I make faux pas. 'Cause I don't care, I suppose." Then, recklessly, "I've been smoking too much. I've got tobacco heart." Myra pictured an all-night tobacco debauch, with Amory pale and reeling from the effect of nicotined lungs. She gave a little gasp. "Oh, Amory, don't smoke. You'll stunt your growth." "I don't care," he persisted gloomily. I got the habit. I've done a lot of things that if my family knew." He hesitated, giving her imagination time to picture dark horrors. "I went to the burlesque show last week." Myra was quite overcome. He turned the green eyes on her again. "You're the only girl in town I like much," he exclaimed in a rush of sentiment. "You're simpatico." Myra was not sure that she was, but it sounded stylish, though vaguely improper. Thick dusk had descended outside, and as the limousine made a sudden turn, she was jolted against him. Their hands touched. "You shouldn't smoke, Amory," she whispered. "Don't you know that?" He shook his head. "Nobody cares." Myra hesitated. "I care." Something stirred within Amory. "Oh, yes, you do. You got a crush on Froggy Parker. I guess everybody knows that." "No, I haven't." Very slowly. A silence while Amory thrilled. There was something fascinating about Myra. shut away here cozily from the dim, chill air. Myra, a little bundle of clothes, with strands of yellow hair curling out from under her skating cap. Because I've got a crush, too. He paused, for he heard in the distance the sound of young laughter, and, peering through the frosted glass along the lamplit street, he made out the dark outline of the bobbing party. He must act quickly. He reached over with a violent, jerky effort and clutched Myra's hand, her thumb to be exact. "Tell him to go to the Minnehaha straight," he whispered. "I want to talk to you. I got to talk to you." Myra made out the party ahead, had an instant vision of her mother, and then, alas for convention, glanced into the eyes beside. "Turn down this side street, Richard, and drive straight to the Minnehaha Club," she cried through the speaking tube. Amory sank back against the cushions with a sigh of relief. "I can kiss her," he thought. "I'll bet I can. I'll bet I can." Overhead, the sky was half crystalline, half misty, and the night around was chill and vibrant with rich tension. From the country club steps, the road stretched away, dark creases on the white blanket, huge heaps of snow lining the sides like the tracks of giant moles. They lingered for a moment on the steps and watched the white holiday moon. "Pale moons like that one." Amory made a vague gesture. "Make people mysterious. You look like a young witch with her cap off and her hair sorta mussed." Her hands clutched at her hair. "Oh, leave it, it looks good." They drifted up the stairs, and Myra led the way into the little den of his dreams, where a cozy fire was burning before a big sink-down couch. A few years later, this was to be a great stage for Amory, a cradle for many an emotional crisis. Now they talked for a moment about bobbing parties. "There's always a bunch of shy fellas," he commented, "sitting at the tail of the bob, sorta lurking and whispering and pushing each other off. Then there's always some crazy cross-eyed girl." He gave a terrifying imitation. "She's always talking hard, sorta, to the chaperone." "You're such a funny boy," puzzled Myra. "How do you mean?" Amory gave immediate attention, on his own ground at last. "Oh, always talking about crazy things. Why don't you come skiing with Marilyn and I tomorrow?" "I don't like girls in the daytime," he said shortly, and then, thinking this a bit abrupt, he added, "But I like you." He cleared his throat. "I like you first and second and third." Myra's eyes became dreamy. What a story this would make to tell Marilyn. Here on the couch with this wonderful-looking boy, the little fire, the sense that they were alone in the great building. Myra capitulated. The atmosphere was too appropriate. "I like you the first 25, she confessed, her voice trembling. "And Froggy Parker 26th. Froggy had fallen 25 places in 1 hour. As yet, he had not even noticed it. But Amory, being on the spot, leaned over quickly and kissed Myra's cheek. He had never kissed a girl before, and he tasted his lips curiously, as if he had munched some new fruit. Then their lips brushed like young wildflowers in the wind. "We're awful," rejoiced Myra gently. She slipped her hand into his, her head drooped against his shoulder. Sudden revulsion seized Amory, disgust, loathing for the whole incident. He desired frantically to be away, never to see Myra again, never to kiss anyone. He became conscious of his face and hers, of their clinging hands, and he wanted to creep out of his body and hide somewhere safe out of sight, up in the corner of his mind. "Kiss me again." Her voice came out of a great void. "I don't want to," he heard himself saying. There was another pause. "I don't want to," he repeated passionately. Myra sprang up, her cheeks pink with bruised vanity, the great bow on the back of her head trembling sympathetically. "I hate you," she cried. "Don't you ever dare to speak to me again." "What?" stammered Amory. "I'll tell Mama you kissed me. I will too. I will too. I'll tell Mama and she won't let me play with you." Amory rose and stared at her helplessly, as though she were a new animal of whose presence on the earth he had not heretofore been aware. The door opened suddenly, and Myra's mother appeared on the threshold, fumbling with her lorgnette. "Well," she began, adjusting it benignantly, "the man at the desk told me you two children were up here. How do you do, Amory?" Amory watched Myra and waited for the crash, but none came. The pout faded, the high pink subsided, and Myra's voice was placid as a summer lake when she answered her mother. "Oh, we started so late, Mama, that I thought we might as well." He heard from below the shrieks of laughter and smelled the vapid odor of hot chocolate and tea cakes as he silently followed mother and daughter downstairs. The sound of the graphophone mingled with the voices of many girls humming the air, and a faint glow was born and spread over him. Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin, Casey Jones, his orders in his hand. Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin, took his farewell journey to the promised land. Amory spent nearly 2 years in Minneapolis. The first winter he wore moccasins that were born yellow, but after many applications of oil and dirt assumed their mature color, a dirty greenish brown. He wore a gray plaid Mackinaw coat and a red toboggan cap. His dog, Count Del Monte, ate the red cap, so his uncle gave him a gray one that pulled down over his face. The trouble with this one was that you breathed into it and your breath froze. One day the darn thing froze his cheek. He rubbed snow on his cheek, but it turned bluish-black just the same. The Count Del Monte ate a box of bluing once, but it didn't hurt him. Later, however, he lost his mind and ran madly up the street, bumping into fences, rolling in gutters, and pursuing his eccentric course out of Amory's life. Amory cried on his bed. "Poor little Count," he cried. "Oh, poor little Count." After several months, he suspected Count of a fine piece of emotional acting. Amory and Frog Parker considered that the greatest line in literature occurred in Act 3 of Arsène Lupin. They sat in the first row at the Wednesday and Saturday matinees. The line was, "If one can't be a great artist or a great soldier, the next best thing is to be a great criminal." Amory fell in love again and wrote a poem. This was it. "Marilyn and Sally, those are the girls for me. Marilyn stands above, Sally in that sweet, deep love." He was interested in whether McGovern of Minnesota would make the first or second All-American, how to do the card pass, how to do the coin pass, chameleon ties, how babies were born, and whether Three-Fingered Brown was really a better pitcher than Christy Mathewson. Among other things he read, "For the Honor of the School," "Little Women," twice, "The Common Law," "Sappho," "Dangerous Dan McGrew," "The Broad Highway," the 3 times, "The Fall of the House of Usher," 3 weeks, "Mary Ware," "The Little Colonel's Chum," "Gunga Din," "The Police Gazette," and "Jim Jam Gems." He had all the Henty biases in history and was particularly fond of the cheerful murder stories of Mary Roberts Rinehart. School ruined his French and gave him a distaste for standard authors. His masters considered him idle, unreliable, and superficially clever. He collected locks of hair from many girls. He wore the rings of several. Finally, he could borrow no more rings, owing to his nervous habit of chewing them out of shape. This, it seemed, usually aroused the jealous suspicions of the next borrower. All through the summer months, Amory and Frog Parker went each week to the stock company. Afterward, they would stroll home in the balmy air of August night, dreaming along Hennepin and Nicollet Avenues, through the gay crowd. Amory wondered how people could fail to notice that he was a boy marked for glory. And when faces of the throng turned toward him and ambiguous eyes stared into his, he assumed the most romantic of expressions and walked on the air cushions that lie on the asphalts of 14. Always, after he was in bed, there were voices, indefinite, fading, enchanting, just outside his window, and before he fell asleep, he would dream one of his favorite waking dreams, the one about becoming a great halfback, or the one about the Japanese invasion when he was rewarded by being made the youngest general in the world. It was always the becoming he dreamed of, never the being. This, too, was quite characteristic of Amory. Code of the young egotist. Before he was summoned back to Lake Geneva, he had appeared, shy but inwardly glowing, in his first long trousers, set off by a purple accordion tie and a Belmont collar with the edges unassailably meeting, purple socks, and handkerchief with a purple border peeping from his breast pocket. But more than that, he had formulated his first philosophy, a code to live by which, as near as it can be named, was a sort of aristocratic egotism. He had realized that his best interests were bound up with those of a certain variant, changing person, whose label, in order that his past might always be identified with him, was Amory Blaine. Amory marked himself a fortunate youth, capable of infinite expansion for good or evil. He did not consider himself a strong character, but relied on his facility, learn things sorta quick, and his superior mentality, read a lot of deep books. He was proud of the fact that he could never become a mechanical or scientific genius. From no other heights was he debarred. Physically, Amory thought that he was exceedingly handsome. He was. He fancied himself an athlete of possibilities and a supple dancer. Socially, here his condition was perhaps most dangerous. He granted himself personality, charm, magnetism, poise, the power of dominating all contemporary males, the gift of fascinating all women. Mentally, complete unquestioned superiority. Now a confession will have to be made. Amory had rather a Puritan conscience. Not that he yielded to it. Later in life, he almost completely slew it. But at 15, it made him consider himself a great deal worse than other boys. Unscrupulousness. The desire to influence people in almost every way, even for evil. A certain coldness and lack of affection, amounting sometimes to cruelty. A shifting sense of honor. An unholy selfishness. A puzzled, furtive interest in everything concerning sex. There was, also, a curious strain of weakness running crosswise through his makeup. A harsh phrase from the lips of an older boy. Older boys usually detested him, was liable to sweep him off his poise into surly sensitiveness or timid stupidity. He was a slave to his own moods, and he felt that though he was capable of recklessness and audacity, he possessed neither courage, perseverance, nor self-respect. Vanity, tempered with self-suspicion if not self-knowledge, a sense of people as automatons to his will, a desire to pass as many boys as possible and get to a vague top of the world. With this background did Amory drift into adolescence. Preparatory to the great adventure. The train slowed up with midsummer languor at Lake Geneva, and Amory caught sight of his mother waiting in her electric on the graveled station drive. It was an ancient electric, one of the early types, and painted gray. The sight of her sitting there, slenderly erect, and of her face, where beauty and dignity combined, melting to a dreamy, recollected smile, filled him with a sudden great pride of her. As they kissed coolly and he stepped into the electric, he felt a quick fear lest he had lost the requisite charm to measure up to her. "Dear boy, you're so tall. Look behind and see if there's anything coming." She looked left and right. She slipped cautiously into a speed of 2 miles an hour, beseeching Amory to act as sentinel. And at one busy crossing, she made him get out and run ahead to signal her forward like a traffic policeman. Beatrice was what might be termed a careful driver. "You are tall, but you're still very handsome. You've skipped the awkward age, or is that 16? Perhaps it's 14 or 15. I can never remember, but you've skipped it." "Don't embarrass me," murmured Amory. "But, my dear boy, what odd clothes. They look as if they were a set, don't they? Is your underwear purple, too?" Amory grunted impolitely. "You must go to Brooks and get some really nice suits. Oh, we'll have a talk tonight or perhaps tomorrow night. I want to tell you about your heart. You've probably been neglecting your heart, and you don't know." Amory thought how superficial was the recent overlay of his own generation. Aside from a minute shyness, he felt that the old cynical kinship with his mother had not been one bit broken. Yet for the first few days, he wandered about the gardens and along the shore in a state of super loneliness, finding a lethargic content in smoking bull at the garage with one of the chauffeurs. The 60 acres of the estate were dotted with old and new summer houses and many fountains and white benches that came suddenly into sight from foliage-hung hiding places. There was a great and constantly increasing family of white cats that prowled the many flower beds and were silhouetted suddenly at night against the darkening trees. It was on one of the shadowy paths that Beatrice at last captured Amory, after Mr. Blaine had, as usual, retired for the evening to his private library. After reproving him for avoiding her, she took him for a long tête-à-tête in the moonlight. He could not reconcile himself to her beauty. That was mother to his own. The exquisite neck and shoulders, the grace of a fortunate woman of 30. "Amory, dear," she crooned softly, "I had such a strange, weird time after I left you." "Did you, Beatrice?" "When I had my last breakdown." She spoke of it as a sturdy, gallant feat. "The doctors told me," her voice sang on a confidential note, "that if any man alive had done the consistent drinking that I have, he would have been physically shattered, my dear, and in his grave, long in his grave." Amory winced and wondered how this would have sounded to Froggy Parker. "Yes," continued Beatrice tragically, "I had dreams, wonderful visions." She pressed the palms of her hands into her eyes. "I saw bronze rivers lapping marble shores, and great birds that soared through the air, party-colored birds with iridescent plumage. I heard strange music and the flare of barbaric trumpets." "What?" Amory had snickered. "What, Amory?" "I said go on, Beatrice." That was all. It merely recurred and recurred. Gardens that flaunted coloring against which this would be quite dull. Moons that whirled and swayed, paler than winter moons, more golden than harvest moons. "Are you quite well now, Beatrice?" "Quite well as I will ever be. I am not understood, Amory. I know that can't express it to you, Amory, but I am not understood." Amory was quite moved. He put his arm around his mother, rubbing his head gently against her shoulder. Poor Beatrice. Poor Beatrice. "Tell me about you, Amory. Did you have 2 horrible years?" Amory considered lying, and then decided against it. "No, Beatrice, I enjoyed them. I adapted myself to the bourgeoisie. I became conventional." He surprised himself by saying that, and he pictured how Froggy would have gaped. "Beatrice," he said suddenly, "I want to go away to school. Everybody in Minneapolis is going to go away to school." Beatrice showed some alarm. "But you're only 15. "Yes, but everybody goes away to school at 15, and I want to, Beatrice." On Beatrice's suggestion, the subject was dropped for the rest of the walk, but a week later she delighted him by saying, "Amory, I have decided to let you have your way. If you still want to, you can go to school." "Yes? To St. Regis's in Connecticut." Amory felt a quick excitement. "It's being arranged," continued Beatrice. "It's better that you should go away. I'd have preferred you to have gone to Eton and then to Christ Church, Oxford. But it seems impracticable now. And for the present, we'll let the university question take care of itself." "What are you going to do, Beatrice?" "Heaven knows. It seems my fate to fret away my years in this country. Not for a second do I regret being American. Indeed, I think that a regret typical of very vulgar people, and I feel sure we are the great coming nation. Yet," and she sighed, "I feel my life should have drowsed away close to an older, mellower civilization. A land of greens and autumnal browns." Amory did not answer, so his mother continued, "My regret is that you haven't been abroad, but still, as you are a man, It's better that you should grow up here under the snarling eagle. Is that the right term? Amory agreed that it was. She would not have appreciated the Japanese invasion. When do I go to school? Next month. You'll have to start east a little early to take your examinations. After that, you'll have a free week, so I want you to go up the Hudson and pay a visit. To who? To Monsignor Darcy, Amory. He wants to see you. He went to Harrow and then to Yale, became a Catholic. I want him to talk to you. I feel he can be such a help. She stroked his auburn hair gently. Dear Amory, dear Amory. Dear Beatrice. So early in September, Amory, provided with 6 suits summer underwear, 6 suits winter underwear, 1 sweater or t-shirt, 1 jersey, 1 overcoat, winter, etc., set out for New England, the land of schools. There were Andover and Exeter with their memories of New England dead, large, college-like democracies. St. Mark's, Groton, St. Regis, recruited from Boston and the Knickerbocker families of New York. St. Paul's, with its great rinks. Pomfret and St. George's, prosperous and well-dressed. Taft and Hotchkiss, which prepared the wealth of the Middle West for social success at Yale. Powling, Westminster, Choate, Kent, and 100 others, all milling out their well-set-up, conventional, impressive type year after year. Their mental stimulus the college entrance exams. Their vague purpose set forth in 100 circulars as to impart a thorough mental, moral, and physical training as a Christian gentleman, to fit the boy for meeting the problems of his day and generation, and to give a solid foundation in the arts and sciences. At St. Regis's, Amory stayed 3 days and took his exams with a scoffing confidence, then doubling back to New York to pay his tutelary visit. The metropolis, barely glimpsed, made little impression on him, except for the sense of cleanliness he drew from the tall white buildings seen from a Hudson River steamboat in the early morning. Indeed, his mind was so crowded with dreams of athletic prowess at school that he considered this visit only as a rather tiresome prelude to the great adventure. This, however, it did not prove to be. Monsignor Darcy's house was an ancient, rambling structure set on a hill overlooking the river, and there lived its owner, between his trips to all parts of the Roman Catholic world, rather like an exiled Stuart king waiting to be called to the rule of his land. Monsignor was 44 then, and bustling, a trifle too stout for symmetry, with hair the color of spun gold and a brilliant, enveloping personality. When he came into a room clad in his full purple regalia from thatch to toe, he resembled a Turner sunset and attracted both admiration and attention. He had written 2 novels, one of them violently anti-Catholic just before his conversion, and 5 years later another, in which he had attempted to turn all his clever jibes against Catholics into even cleverer innuendos against Episcopalians. He was intensely ritualistic, startlingly dramatic, loved the idea of God enough to be a celibate, and rather liked his neighbor. Children adored him because he was like a child. Youth reveled in his company because he was still a youth and couldn't be shocked. In the proper land and century, he might have been a Richelieu. At present, he was a very moral, very religious, if not particularly pious clergyman, making a great mystery about pulling rusty wires and appreciating life to the fullest, if not entirely enjoying it. He and Amory took to each other at first sight. The jovial, impressive prelate who could dazzle an embassy ball, and the green-eyed, intent youth in his first long trousers accepted in their own minds a relation of father and son within a half-hour's conversation. My dear boy, I've been waiting to see you for years. Take a big chair and we'll have a chat. I've just come from school, St. Regis's, you know. So your mother says, a remarkable woman, have a cigarette. I'm sure you smoke. Well, if you're like me, you loathe all science and mathematics. Amory nodded vehemently. Hate 'em all, like English and history. Of course, you'll hate school for a while too, but I'm glad you're going to St. Regis's. Why? Because it's a gentleman's school, and democracy won't hit you so early. You'll find plenty of that in college. I want to go to Princeton, said Amory. I don't know why. but I think of all Harvard men as sissies, like I used to be, and all Yale men as wearing big blue sweaters and smoking pipes." Monsignor chuckled. "I'm one, you know." "Oh, you're different. I think of Princeton as being lazy and good-looking and aristocratic. You know, like a spring day. Harvard seems sort of indoors. And Yale is November, crisp and energetic," finished Monsignor. That's it. They slipped briskly into an intimacy from which they never recovered. "I was for Bonnie Prince Charlie," announced Amory. "Of course you were, and for Hannibal." "Yes, and for the Southern Confederacy." He was rather skeptical about being an Irish patriot. He suspected that being Irish was being somewhat common, but Monsignor assured him that Ireland was a romantic lost cause, and Irish people quite charming, and that it should, by all means, be one of his principal biases. After a crowded hour, which included several more cigarettes, and during which Monsignor learned, to his surprise but not to his horror, that Amory had not been brought up a Catholic, he announced that he had another guest. This turned out to be the Honorable Thornton Hancock of Boston, ex-minister to The Hague, author of an erudite history of the Middle Ages and the last of a distinguished, patriotic, and brilliant family. "He comes here for a rest," said Monsignor confidentially, treating Amory as a contemporary. "I act as an escape from the weariness of agnosticism, and I think I'm the only man who knows how his staid old mind is really at sea and longs for a sturdy spar like the church to cling to." Their first luncheon was one of the memorable events of Amory's early life. He was quite radiant and gave off a peculiar brightness and charm. Monsignor called out the best that he had thought by question and suggestion, and Amory talked with an ingenious brilliance of 1,000 impulses and desires and repulsions and faiths and fears. He and Monsignor held the floor, and the older man, with his less receptive, less accepting, yet certainly not colder mentality, seemed content to listen and bask in the mellow sunshine that played between these two. Monsignor gave the effect of sunlight to many people. Amory gave it in his youth, and, to some extent, when he was very much older, but never again was it quite so mutually spontaneous. "He's a radiant boy," thought Thornton Hancock, who had seen the splendor of 2 continents and talked with Parnell and Gladstone and Bismarck. And afterward he added to Monsignor, "But his education ought not to be entrusted to a school or college." But for the next 4 years, the best of Amory's intellect was concentrated on matters of popularity, the intricacies of a university social system and American society, as represented by Biltmore teas and Hot Springs golf links. In all, a wonderful week that saw Amory's mind turned inside out, 100 of his theories confirmed, and his joy of life crystallized to 1,000 ambitions. Not that the conversation was scholastic. Heaven forbid. Amory had only the vaguest idea as to what Bernard Shaw was. But Monsignor made quite as much out of the beloved vagabond and Sir Nigel, taking good care that Amory never once felt out of his depth. But the trumpets were sounding for Amory's preliminary skirmish with his own generation. "You're not sorry to go, of course. With people like us, our home is where we are not," said Monsignor. "I am sorry." "No, you're not. No one person in the world is necessary to you or to me." "Well, goodbye."